Each morning, retired truck driver Don Houghton leaves his Barrie apartment and takes the short drive across the city to an unoccupied office building. Inside lies his special project, his dream, his labor of love.
I'm scratch building a scale model of HMCS Barrie, which was a corvette during World War II, named after the town of Barrie. And the ultimate goal is to present it to the city of Barrie in November, on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. I've been doing modeling. I've had peak periods and periods which I haven't done any models through my employment days. I first became exposed to modeling when I was about 5 years old through my father. And at that time, I got quite interested, and he took an interest in showing me how to read plans, how to lay out material on the plans, how to read grains of wood, etc., etc. And of course, while I was in the Navy myself in the early 50s, on some of these long cruises, I had time to do models, and that helped when we were at sea. One of my ships that I was on was the Haida, which is sitting down in Toronto right now. And I was on the Uchimont, the Buckingham, and the Penetang.
No detail will be left out on the HMCS Barrie. She will be exactly as she was during the war years, as Don explains.
If you're going to do a scale model, you have to incorporate what the ship had and everything to scale. And to just say, okay, we'll just have this, but I haven't got room for that, is not a true reproduction of the ship itself.
While Don spent the first few weeks studying old photographs and drafting plans for the Barrie, a 1,500-pound white pine log was being prepared for delivery.
Well, we obtained a pine log from Maurice Miller Lumber in Barrie, and he was kind enough to donate that. And it was squared up, and it was brought into the shop, and we start cutting it down to the outside maximum diameter. I don't think anybody will be disappointed. In fact, I think, knowing my work after it is completed, most people who have seen my work in the past have just stood there and looked at it and couldn't say anything.
Winston Churchill called corvettes the cheap but nasties. It was the little ship that could. Primarily used to escort convoys of merchant ships to and from Britain, the corvette faced the threat of German U-boats while enduring the North Atlantic's elements. Between 1940 and 1945, 122 corvettes were built cheaply and quickly in Canadian shipyards. The first 10 ships built for the Royal Navy were named after flowers, such as HMCS Trillium, Bittersweet, and Eyebright. The remainder were given names of towns and cities in Canada. Included in this group were HMCS Collingwood, Aurelia, and Her Majesty's Canadian ship Barrie K-138, built in 1940 at the shipyards in Collingwood. Although the Collingwood shipyards are now deserted, the large empty buildings and vacant slips noted for the sideways launch are a stark reminder of the once busy shipyards and the urgency that prevailed during the war years.
I started in the shipyard in 1940, and I started in with the electrician gang, and of course, there was no boats built up, no corvettes. They just nicely laid the keel for the first corvettes then, and there was 2 keels laid on the east dock and number 1 dry dock, and then when they were launched, they started building 4 at a time on the west dock, and this was quite a feat, building 4 boats at one time. just like precision, eh? That was the whole thing. Just one from, and the tradesmen, they just went from one boat to the other. As soon as you had so much to do, like myself, I helped do the switchboards and the generators and that in the engine rooms and that. And then when that was completed, when you had them completed, you went on to the next boat. That's if the companies that were making this equipment for us could supply it in time.
Despite the hurried pace to get the ships into battle, the corvette would meet the demands of the sea, a credit to the men who built them.
They were a riveted boat, and they had a little give to them when they were in the sea, and they were built so that they could turn on a dime and chase a submarine quite easily. We're the best shipbuilding town there was in the Dominion of Canada. Yes, sir.
Before Don could start work on the HMCS Barrie model, a chainsaw was needed to cut the log down to its maximum outside diameter.
Well, we've gone this far. I think he's going to do a super job on it. A lot of work yet. This is just the start. This is the easy part. Ron's got all the hard work to do.
Shaping the hull was the first step on the model for Don, and the most important.
Think of the hull as the foundation of the house. You got to get the foundation right in order for the rest of the house to be true. And the hull is the hardest, tedious part. Can be boring, but you got to be on top of it. But once the hull is done, then you get it. They start doing the bridge and the gun platform, and that's the areas that I really get excited about. And it starts to show your work and your craftsmanship when you get into the intricate details of the thing. There are some models around of different scale sizes, and some of them are done in the pre-forecastle extension style, which was, for instance, the mast was ahead of the bridge, the forecastle brake was at the bridge, and what I'm doing is how she ended up in World War II. Now in '43 she had her forecastle extension and a major refit in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And from '43 right through to the end of the war, this is how she remained, and this is how I'm doing it. And also, she's probably best recognized in her final refit form. I have a lot of respect for them. No regular meals, no regular sleep, trying to deal with the stress of performing their duties in terms of hunting and being vigilant there for submarines. When a merchantman was sunk, then the stress of rescuing, and anybody that would go to war with no guarantee of coming home has my highest respect.
They used to say that corvettes would roll on wet grass. They were originally built, I think, as a trawler, fishing vessel sort of thing. But there was the need for ships quickly when the war broke out in 1939. And somebody had the idea that these could be adapted to escort vessels. They didn't have great speed, 15 knots or 16 knots be about your top speed, which would be equivalent of about 20 miles an hour. But then on the other hand, your convoys were usually much slower than that, so that you could keep up with them and guard them. They originally built to hold about 60 people in the crew. By the time the late years of the war, with the addition of ASTIC, or sonar as they call it now, and radar people, the crew size had expanded to over 100. But there was still only accommodation for 60. And it wasn't too bad when you're at sea because, well, it wasn't as bad when you're at sea because 1/3 of the ship's company would be on watch, and you had that much more room in the mess deck. When you arrived in port, and nobody was up in the crow's nest or up the gunnery stand, that sort of thing, well then, you were really crowded, and you had to really try to fend for yourself as far as space, to sleep, find a place to sit and eat, play cards or whatever.
No, it wasn't comfortable at all. It was very, very rough. My experience, well, I was just a kid at the time, and I was pulled out of an emergency pool at Peregrine, Halifax. About 2 o'clock in the morning, they needed somebody all of a sudden. Somebody hadn't shown up for their shift, and they needed a telegrapher, so they got me down to the dockyards and over the side and on board this ship, and it was mid-March, I believe. Very rough. There's nothing worse than the North Atlantic in the middle of March, and so I really got my initiation. It was very rough. And I recall eating in the mess, for example. You had to hang on to everything, you know. We'd just go from side to side, and it wasn't the most comfortable conditions. Many's the time you couldn't go up top on deck at all, of course, and if you did, sometimes the horizon would be way up there instead of out there, you know. It was very rough. They got kicked around very badly because they were short. But that made them maneuverable too, so that's the advantage, I suppose. But the disadvantage is the getting kicked around by the seas as badly as they did.
Well, I was a naval seaman, but I was in submarine detection, which is a means of tracing submarine movement underwater. There was a instrument below the ship that sent out sound signals, and if it hit a school of fish or any big object there, it would bring back an echo to you. So they used to call us ping merchants because we sent out a ping to get a reverberation back to us, an echo. And we would follow that pattern if the captain thought it was a submarine. In our first few trips, we went to St. John's, Newfoundland, and we had to get out. The spray would come over and freeze on every part of the ship. We'd have to get out and bang away and chip that ice off so that we wouldn't get top heavy. It was pretty rough. It be well, and you had to hang on, boy.
Her Majesty's Canadian ship Lindsay was almost torn in half by a Royal Navy destroyer in the darkness and fog in March of 1945.
But we were in the English Channel, and it was very, very dense fog. You couldn't see a thing. I was on duty, as a matter of fact, at the time, and we were hit by an English destroyer, which is a bigger ship than ours. The second, our second lieutenant saved our ship by veering a complete starboard, but the other ship took everything off the port side of our ship, made a great big hole in our fore part of the ship, took all the carly floats and the life-saving equipment off. We were called to action stations and ready to abandon ship, but we were able to sort of limp into harbor, you might say, because one engine worked. We got there, took a long time, but we didn't have to abandon ship, and nobody was injured.
Must have been pretty frightening.
Oh, it's frightening, yes. We were, you know, young kids. We were ready to jump overboard, and you know, but we limped back in.
We were the sheepdog, and with a convoy, we would take maybe 100 to 120 ships, and they would be lined up, say, in groups of 10 lines, 12 deep, and our escort group would consist of probably 5 corvettes, one ahead of the convoy and one on each corner. And the whole convoy would zigzag a pattern so that there was no definite straight line. And plus the zigzag, we had to do a zigzag also to improve the search areas.
I remember I got seasick often, as did many other, mostly new members of the crew. We'd get quite seasick. And I remember going up on watch, having to take a pail with me for obvious reasons. So I remember being, they used to call me Buckets sometimes because I had my pail with me, but I wasn't the only one. But those were not very, that wasn't very good days. That's on the rough days.
With the rough cuts done on the main hull, Don began to separate the structure from the remainder of the log in order to start shaping the deck area.
Well, and the whaler I'm using balsa because the whaler is much smaller, obviously, but the balsa is easy to work with, especially when you get down to carving the oars and the seats and the tiller and whatever. So I'm using balsa, and there will be some balsa, but the bulk of the model, apart from the hull and the bridge and after superstructure type thing, a lot of it is recycled material. And you'll find that is how a lot of scratch builders work, is with finding different things and saying, oh, this is just ideal for this or that.
As with the men on the corvettes, it was not always smooth sailing for Don in this project.
It was very, very wet. And as it's drying out, it was cracking. And I've made a couple of procedures in which to prevent it from severely cracking. And I think it's going to work out okay in the end. If it didn't, I'd give up, and I'm not one to give up. Since we've started this project, it's come to my attention that one of the captains of the Barrie is alive and well. There's other members of the Barrie, and something that was on plan, but a thought that had just crossed my mind. Here's a chance for these guys to get together again and talk about old times. You'll find a lot of vets will talk about old times, but they'll talk about the good times. Very rarely will they talk about the bad times.
Well, 50 years is a long time ago. To remember it all clearly is pretty hard. It was went in the Navy in the end of 40. I think we went to Barrie in 42. I was the ASDIC and radar officer on the ship, and that was about which I knew very little, but we had technicians, of course, that knew what the game was all about. And as the war progressed, those technical aspects became more important in order to find where the enemy was, if you could, and in order to keep the convoy in as safe a position as possible. Life on the Barrie, they were very good bunch of guys. Now, when 100 or whatever it is guys live together in very close quarters, you gotta have blow-ups every once in a while. That's just part of life. The officers were segregated in quarters from the rest of the crew. The food, which was adequate till you've been out of a couple of weeks, and then it got pretty bad, and then it got worse, and once in a while you'd get down to kind of biscuits and stuff, but that was very rare. We looked very much forward to getting into the U.S. ports, where we could have ice cream and cigarettes if you wanted, and it was a very different life than opposed to our kind of activity. And the Brits were at the other end. They didn't have much of anything, and naturally and normally were somewhat resentful of the style of living that particularly the Americans had. The main thing on that ship was we had pretty good esprit de corps, and we were proud of that. We enjoyed that.
Well, when I first joined the Barrie from King's, that's the officers' training establishment, I served as the navigating officer, but only for a short period because we had a specialist come aboard, Lou Stonehouse, who took over as navigating officer, and I became the signals officer. The morale was terrific on the ship. I was fortunate with the officers that I was associated with. I learned a great deal from all of them. The comradeship it's hard to describe, really, and the morale of the ship was great, and we had a lot of fun. There were those trying moments too, but it was a real positive experience for me. Lieutenant Stockless was the captain. My biggest recollection was that he was a bridge player, and he helped to teach me to play bridge, and we used to have some great games in the wardroom when we were off watch. So, well, Don Boxer was he was a character. I don't know, he was a fun guy, I should say. He kidded people along, and the big thing about Don that I remember was that he would encourage me to go to university after the war. And that advice I appreciate because I took it, and it certainly paid off.
Well, Bill was the youngest officer, I guess, and from a small town, and really never been to big cities or that kind of stuff, but a great guy and fun, and always in some kind of trouble, or just decent trouble, you know, something would get screwed up all the time.
You'll find occasionally you get so involved in your work and you get installing things, and first thing you know, you've got the area done, and you say, uh-oh, how do I get in there to paint that? So you have to sort of paint before it's actually done. Everything is to scale. A carpenter will measure twice and cut once. You'll find a modeler will measure 10 times, and then he doesn't know if he should cut. He'll go back and check again, at least this modeler. And like I said, keep going back and checking and looking at pictures and laying it down and working on this and going back, looking again and checking again. It's, in the course of a day, you might be in the shop, let's say, for argument's sake, 8 hours. But on actual working on the model, it might be 3 or 4. The rest of the time is research, looking at pictures, fitting, cutting. Well, we just finished doing the bandstand this morning, installing the main structure of it. Obviously, there's more bracing to go in. Next one I'm going to work on is the 4-inch gun platform. I got the rear bulkhead in and fit it. I'm going to remove it after a while, and then so I can work on the inside there, installing the workbench and hanging some tools on the bulkhead. And then when we do install this permanently, we're going to have leave the passageway open so people can see in there and say, oh, that's where the shipwright's shop was, aboard ship. Aboard this class of ship, anyway.
Harry McGill was a fine officer and a gentleman, good with the crew, knew his business, spent a lot of time in the Navy, like all of us, was very glad to get out, and I would consider him a very dear friend. We've kept in touch, although increasingly spasmodically as the years roll by.
First Lieutenant Harry McGill became one of 5 commanding officers of the Barrie at a period when corvettes were being constantly modified with new equipment as their role increased.
In Liverpool, in Nova Scotia, in refit. And that's where I was the captain. And as everybody, we got down to about 15 or 20 on board in the refit, and then as the refit progressed, more of the new crew arrived. The kids I felt sorry for were the kids coming from Alberta, Saskatchewan, had never seen the ocean, and then they get drafted to a corvette. It was like a canoe as far as they were concerned.
Commander R.M. Mosier was the first captain of the Barrie, and unlike many volunteer reserve officers such as Harry McGill, Mosier had been a seaman all his life.
And the captain, old Mosier, he was a genius at manipulating the ship. He didn't fight it too well, but he admitted that. But he was a seaman. He'd been at sea all his life. And he went up to Collingwood and picked up the corvette. But I couldn't have asked for a better captain as far as taking the ship out and you saying to yourself, well, he'll bring it back. Now, if we got torpedoed, that's different. But it didn't make any difference how rough it was. That didn't bother him in the least. It bothered me, because I wasn't too sure we were going to come back, but it didn't bother him in the least.
On September 2nd, 1944, HMCS Barrie rescued 14 survivors in the Western Atlantic from the torpedoed merchant ship SS Livingston. 14 men went down with the ship. First Lieutenant Harry McGill was in charge of the seaboat's crew, which carried out the rescue.
There was a signal came through that a ship had been torpedoed between St. John's, Newfoundland, where we were at the time, and Greenland. Well, that's an awful lot of space. But we went up to look, and of course the ship had sunk. But there were about, I think there were 8, there may have been more than that, in 2 lifeboats. Now, they were alive, but they were not in good shape. So that's when I went with those characters there out in a seaboat over to see if any of them were alive. Well, they were. So we brought them back to the Barrie, and then there was a scramble net, they called them, put down the side, and we could have the kids hang on, and then the chaps who were still on the Barrie, they leaned over and got them on board. Everybody was alive, of the ones we brought. Now, whether they died from there or not, I don't know, but they hadn't been in the water that long.
Able-bodied seaman Al Brundage was a member of the seaboat's crew that took part in the rescue of the merchant marines.
And after we picked the fellows up, we had to transfer them. There was an officer, or pardon me, a doctor, I should say, aboard this ship, which was traveling with the whole deal. And we had to transfer a couple of fellows, so we had to put them on the seaboat's crew. But when we're in the seaboat, the thing was we're trained in the whaler with your oars. We had to use paddles, because we couldn't, the sea was so rough that we had to paddle ourselves up and down the swells to get the men to the other ship. Lieutenant McGill, he did a good job. He was in charge of the seaboat crew. And mind you, you got a bunch of young fellows that to be dropped over in the Atlantic in the middle of it. You could say how deep it would be, I don't even know. But when you figure sometime that you're only young fellows from the ages of, 17 to 21, 20, whatever it is. But the fellows did a good job, and the men that lowered the boat over the side of the ship did a wonderful job, and they got us back. So you can take for a bunch of fellows that were not sailors before the war, and to get involved in something like that, they sure are great men.
And I'm not at all sure time muddies all this to a very large degree, but I do remember being ready for anything when they were getting alongside to bring them in, grabbing one of them, and he was cold. And I was ready for all kinds of injuries and blood and whatever, but not the fact that the guy was cold. I don't know if he ever made it or not. I don't know that. And then what the real thing was, we had to get them inboard quickly, because the submarines, having sunk, I think it was the Livingston, waiting if they'd got a signal off, now the lifeboat is bobbing around in the water, and if they hover close by and somebody comes by to pick them up, hey, that's a pretty easy target. Well, we were quick, and nothing ever happened. We just got, and it took them fine, I think, in St. John's.
The interesting fact on this story was that after the war, I believe it was in about '82, I was in contact with a gentleman from the UK who was researching the history of the sub, the U-541. He wrote me and gave me information on that sub, which was the one that sank the Livingston. And what struck me was that they had intercepted a signal that the Barrie would be escorting a Lady Rodney as a troop ship to St. John's, and actually they were out looking for us when they sunk the Livingston. So it makes you think when you look back.
I like getting into the little stuff and neat and little tiny meticulous stuff. I like that. Like I was saying, I referred it to earlier, like building a house, the hull's got to be, is like a foundation. Well, I don't know about you, but I never liked building a foundation. But when I got into making the rooms and kitchen cabinets or whatever, that's where I started to enjoy it. Overall, I'm very pleased with the way it's turning out. I'm happy with it. I hope everybody else will be, too. I'm getting more relaxed with it now. I was very nervous, as you may know, earlier with the hull. We didn't know which direction it was going to go because of being so wet, but it's finally dried out. We've checked all the cracking that was done, repaired them, and obviously the Mall is getting much lighter, too, at the same time to work with. Where before it took a couple of hefty guys to lift it. And now you're getting three-dimensional aspects to it. I was scared there for a while it was going to look like the African Queen. But it's coming. It's coming. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, so we'll see how many words will be spoken when the project's over.
There was one other instance that really stands out in my mind, and that was we were detached from a convoy to take some ships into Sydney, Nova Scotia, along with the Shawinigan, another corvette. And after we tied up in Sydney, we were given a couple of days for rest. and we were given an order to go out and do a search out in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for a sub that was out there. But the order was changed, and we were then sent to Halifax, and the Shawinigan was sent out to do that search. And she was never heard from again. All they did find was a couple of survivors on a Carly float. And I remember one of those survivors was a young prospect for the Maple Leafs as a defenseman. I can't remember his name, but that really makes you think about fate and luck.
We recognized that the enemy, the German boys and girls, had their job to do, and we had our job to do. And we were fighting for a cause that we really believed in, and I suppose most of them believed in their cause. I'm not sure of that. There was no animosity, no real hate between ourselves and the Germans.
I got to say, you got to have respect for the enemy when you look at a submarine and how they live in that. I don't think I could do that.
The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril, wrote Winston Churchill in his memoirs. Between 1939 and the middle of 1943, the U-boat was indeed winning the Battle of the Atlantic, sinking ships at an alarming rate. Werner Hirschman was 17 when he joined the German Navy in 1940. By 1944, he was Chief Engineering Officer of the U-190, at a time when German subs were often sank on their first mission.
We changed from being the hunters to becoming the hunted. The first 3 years were called the happy times, and the last 2 years we called the sour pickle times. There's absolutely no comparison between those two periods, because during the first 3 years, submarines spent practically all their lives at the surface and only went down to attack during the day or to get away for a couple of hours. But otherwise, then they came up again and pursued convoys at the surface, or had a swim if they were in the South Atlantic somewhere. Whereas when I went out there in 1944 and 1945, we spent 95% of our time submerged, and this is something which the boat were really not built for. We did not have submarines. We had diving boats, which is a much better description. We had left Lorient, our base in France, in February 1944, and we came back in June. Now this base, of course, has something like 20, 25 submarines based there, at least, probably more than that. And there is a continuous coming and going within this base. In other words, after we had left, or another 15 boats left after us at some time or the other. But during those 4 months when we were out there, not a single submarine had returned. In other words, we left and we came back, and no boat in between came back. We were actually told something, I mean, not officially, but told, never mind sinking ships, please just come back. The terrifying aspect of a depth charge attack is you're down there at about 600 to 700 feet, and you hear the splash of the depth charge entering the water above you, and you know in about 20 seconds or something like that, that thing is going to go off. And if it hits you, you're gone. If it doesn't, you wait for the next one. And this, as I say, it can go for hundreds of depth charges, can go for, you know, a day or two. And each time when you hear that thing, you are scared stiff down there. I mean, there is no doubt about it. Anybody who denies that he was scared stiff during these hours, you know, is a liar as far as I'm concerned.
On April 16th, 1945, the U-190 encountered the minesweeper HMCS Esquimalt off the coast of Halifax.
On that April 16th, we heard an Aztec pinging, in other words, their location device to find submarines. We hear this inside the boat. So we stuck our periscope out and saw the HMCS Barrie, which of course we didn't identify at that time, approaching rapidly from astern, and since we heard the Aztec inside, we were 100% sure that they had found us and were now approaching to attack. And so at that time, the only way to get out of this mess was to fire a torpedo at them, an acoustic torpedo, which would find that ship by its propeller noises, and hope for the best. The torpedo, yes, blew off the stern of the Esquimalt, and she went down very, very quickly. We heard the sinking noises. One does hear that when a ship goes down, the compartments break, but of course we did not see anything of the fate of the people aboard the Esquimalt. All this I learned, of course, only much, much later from books and from the talks of the survivors. Well, Hitler never had any interest in navies in the first place. Hitler had no concept whatsoever of global thinking. All he was totally continental in his approach to everything, and he never really understood the importance of a navy in the first place, and also not quite the importance of the navy in this particular war against England. When I hear the stories of the crew members of the corvettes, what they had to go through in the storms of the Atlantic during winter time, I could only burst out with saying, thank God I was in a submarine and not on one of those ships. I got along very, very well with the 5 Canadian officers and the 30 men who the Canadian frigates put aboard at the moment of surrender, which was about 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland. So we had a very nice time. We sort of, the relationship between these Canadian officers and myself was some of utter mutual respect, because in the end, all of us had really one very common enemy to see rather than the enemy.
Although there was much more work to do on the model, it was felt that a sneak preview of Don's creation to the local media was necessary to inform the public about this historic event.
I'm excited about it. The Barrie Corvette is part of our history from the Second World War, and the fact that we have a local craftsman who is rebuilding a model of what was an important corvette during the war, and that it's going to be available for the city to display as part of our history reinvented, and I'm delighted.
Most Canadians don't realize that at the end of World War II, Canada possessed the 3rd largest navy in the world. A large part of this naval heritage has already been forgotten, and it's only through projects like this that the next generation will be reminded of the importance of our naval heritage and what it meant to the last generation and the thousands of Canadians that served in all arms.
I'm hoping that, first of all, it will be well received, and I'm reasonably confident it will be based on my work. But more importantly, there was a period in which the town, the county, the province, the country got together and they worked together. Everybody worked together. Money was scarce in the 40s. But people always found money to buy war bonds, to give up their time to knit blankets and quilts and socks and sweaters. And I don't think the young people today can comprehend how people got together to do these things. I think it's life today is taken very much for granted. And there is some history there. And I hope there never is another war of any sort, anywhere. But history has proven that there's always some adversary action going on somewhere around the world.
town of Barrie were very good to us. And being from Ontario and from Toronto, I'd always liked Barrie and been there lots of times. And I remember they did a lot of nice things for us. They sent us all kinds of clothes, I'm sure. I'm sure of that. And I think they sent us a piano. And in return, when we sent them the ship's bell, which I believe is now in the armory or wherever. And yes, there was they would write and send us things all the time, and we would keep in touch with them. It was a good relationship.
I just like to say in my own mind that the people from Barrie were super good, because I know there were things that came from Barrie, different organizations, that we maybe not realize as young fellows and appreciate. We did appreciate, but then maybe never just think that all these things were coming from, because I think as young fellows, maybe you're just too busy not to even sit down and write a thank you note or something like that.
They were fantastic. Anything we ever asked for, they sent us, and they sent us a lot of other things that we didn't ask for. And everything was first rate, absolutely. And this white piano that we got, I don't know what pianos cost, but this was a beauty. But it was small with a white stool. See, well, there was no such thing as, well, they're on a Corvette or they're in the Navy and there's going to be wet out there. Well, we don't have to worry about it. No, sir. Right top hole all the way. Washing machine. Now, somebody thought, oh, what the hell? You couldn't get a washing machine. Barrie got one and sent it to us. And it worked practically 24 hours a day. I couldn't say enough. They couldn't have done any more. And everything they did was first class.
By the middle of September, Don had put in an excess of 1,500 manpower hours working on the model. The end was in sight.
It's been a community project. Someone said, "Jesus, it's a great thing what you're doing." And I had to correct the person quite innocently in the fact that it hasn't been Don Houghton's project. Without the sponsors, the donors, the people that made the display case, her crew, that they all jumped in enthusiastically and gave up their time. So it's been a community project. It hasn't been Don's project. It's a community. Barrie should be proud. This has been the most important model I've ever done, obviously, because of what's taken place with it. But to be associated in some small way with ex-crew members and to meet them and to have their opinion of the work, I'm looking forward to it. And for me, that's probably going to be one of the most exciting, and seeing the reaction on the people's faces when it's unveiled, that will tell me a lot. I'm just in awe of the people that went to see and put their lives on the line and lived under these conditions.
A moment of pride at Barrie City Hall last night at a community project that was unveiled.
It's a pint-sized representation of a giant-sized memory of the HMCS Barrie. Videographer Don Wright has the story.
Very wonderful evening, and we were privileged to have been invited to this occasion, and the model is terrific.
This has been a community project. Everyone that even had any knowledge of it was very supportive. And for the citizenry of Barrie, I wish to thank you for the opportunity. this will be my most important piece of work.
I think the corvettes are an instance of what the country could do when called upon. I hope that the youngsters of today will appreciate what some of the men went through.
The corvettes played the only role that it would be sensible for Canada to play, and that was to be an escort service. They did a very, very good job. They were well built, quickly built. For whatever reason, the government couldn't seem to time together. They'd either have too many ships available or too much crews available, and it was a little frustrating. But by and large, I think we were all proud to have served in the Navy and in corvettes.
Eternal Father, strong to save. You didn't realize what stress you're under. You just went about your duties, and we all did. And just thankful to be back and that the war is over, and hope we don't have anything like that again.
I think they'd look upon them as a bit of an oddity, really. They're such a homely-looking craft, really, even today, looking at the pictures. But I would hope that they would go down in history as being a major force in the Battle of the Atlantic.
I was proud of what I did, very proud. And I felt we did the job. And if I was called on, I'd be proud to be called on.
HMCS Barrie made her last trip up the St. Lawrence to Sorel on June 23, 1945, where she was handed over to the War Assets Corporation. The Barrie was later sold to an Argentine shipping company and renamed the Gasistado. In 1957, she was taken over by the Argentine Navy and renamed Captain Canepa. HMCS Barrie K-138 was broken up in 1972. HMCS Sackville is the only remaining corvette of the 123 ships of Canada's wartime fleet. Corvettes did indeed have their shortcomings. Ill-equipped, especially in the early part of the war, overcrowding and inexperienced crews, but it is the men of these small ships that made up for any lack of naval grandeur. They were the heart and soul of the Canadian Navy, and their mere presence at sea aboard these small ships helped guide convoys safely to their destination. The corvette was the little ship that could, with the men that would.
No, the Barrie, people should be proud of the Barrie because it did a great job during the war.
That if I had to do it over again, I'd go in the Navy, and I'm sure I wouldn't go on a Corvette now because there wouldn't be any. It's changed so much. But I would go back on a Corvette, for sure. And I would want it with Barrie on the side of it.